Now, you are a senior policy fellow at Restore Britain. Restore Britain?
Restore Britain, yes.
This is Rupert Lowe's movement to save Britain, to restore Britain to something, and we'll talk about what that is. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what Restore is and why you decided to join Rupert Lowe's team?
Well, in reverse order, the reason I decided to join Rupert Lowe's team is because I've met Rupert Lowe on a number of occasions, and contrary to many people in politics, he appears to be in it for the right reasons. He's independently wealthy, so he's not doing it for clout. He was already a public figure of sorts prior to entering into politics, and so he seems to have the zeal of a man on a mission, and he seems to care about the issues themselves rather than how they might reflect on him. And he's curious. He's eager to learn. He listens to feedback with great interest. This is also very encouraging, and because he is fundamentally politically ambitious, and I mean that. I don't mean that in the sense of being personally ambitious. I mean that in the sense of he thinks of politics as an activity in which you should be doing your best to try and reshape the Overton window rather than slavishly following it, as many people do. Many people enter into politics and they think of the existing moral language or the prevailing value structures that infuse our society as, by their very nature, authoritative, and you just need to play the game within those bounds. That is the very pedestrian approach to politics. It's one that populists in particular fall into, because populists are very anxious to amplify public opinion rather than trying to reshape public opinion or to carry things in a different direction and to show leadership and all the rest of it. But occasionally, once in a generation or so, you do get these creative figures emerging in politics, left or right. To be clear, I'm talking about a style of politics here, no sort of ideological bias baked into what I'm saying. Tony Blair was certainly one of them. He saw politics as an opportunity to do things that you want to do, that you think are in the national interest, or he'd probably prefer to say in the global interest. And Rupert Lowe is similarly inclined, thinks of himself as a potentially creative figure in politics. The key difference, of course, is that he's interested in pursuing Britain's national interest, or indeed recalling us to a sense of national interest, indeed reaffirming our right to have one.
Okay, so it's called Restore.
Yes.
What do you want to restore? Is there sort of a time period we want to restore?
No, it's not as crude as all that. I mean, people differ over when they think things went drastically wrong, like when did civilization go off the cliff. Everyone has their favourite theory. Some trace it back to the Reformation, some trace it back to the Enlightenment, some trace it back to the 1960s, others pick 1997. There is I suppose, if I may speak somewhat personally, the experience of being a young conservative, and I'm sure, a young conservative-minded person, as I would prefer to say nowadays, is that of having felt cheated out of an inheritance that was rightly yours, and yet for whatever reason was not passed down to you. This is why, when you find yourself living in a vaguely healthy society, let's say it has homogeneous demographics, for instance. There's a sort of rough, not an absolute moral consensus, but a rough moral consensus, such that politics becomes basically an activity in which you're negotiating how to implement the values that you already share, rather than trying to construct a whole new value system altogether. When you have that sort of society in place, being conservative-minded makes a great deal of sense, because you find yourself surrounded by and embedded in forms of life that you regard as fundamentally good. And it's quite sensible in those circumstances that you don't want to be reckless and cautious about it. You don't want to embark on utopian projects that might, set things off course. You want to preserve it, you want to conserve it. Now, the experience of being a young conservative-minded person is having felt cheated out of all that, along a whole range of dimensions. Demographically, cheated out of a homogeneous homeland of our own, in which we are the unquestioned majority. The Anglo-Celtic peoples of Britain are the unquestioned majority, who are not stateless and have a right to determine their own future in their own homeland, as indeed they recognise the rights of other peoples or elsewhere in the world to chart their own destiny. Constitutionally cheated out of an inheritance. Britain used to be run in a very Rolls-Royce-like fashion when we had, put it this way, I think this might be slightly off in terms of the statistics, but in 1911 we had one lawyer for every 1,000 people in Britain, which was sort of reflective of the fact that we weren't an extremely litigious society with loads of statutes that were sort of regulating us, holding us down, specifying rationalistically in advance what we were allowed to do and what we weren't allowed to do. So much of it was just entrusted to precedent, to common law. Now we have one lawyer for every 300 people, which is reflective of the fact that statute law in particular has expanded at a machine-like pace and scale over the last 100 years as parliaments have just been busily passing legislation. And often this is actually restrictive of human activities. It makes your society less free, it makes it less flourishing. So I would want to reverse and restore us back to a situation in which we weren't sort of drowning in legalistic diktats and all the rest of it. Restoring Britain's older constitution before Tony Blair came along and committed an act of constitutional vandalism as well as demographic vandalism. So I suppose those would be the two major dimensions that we are interested in, along which we are interested in restoring Britain's demographics and restoring Britain's constitution.
Not a small task.
No.
You mentioned 1911, so maybe we're going to restore to 1911. I like the date. They used to have like 1,000 people in the India office running a subcontinent. So, yeah, the government could be more efficient, I suppose. Sticking on the demographics thing, so you said that you want to restore Britain's demographics. What's your plan to do that? How could that practically happen?
Well, I'm not going to compose policy on the hoof, so I will be heading up the policy unit and drawing in outside help, both public and private, to try and put practical meat on the policy bone, because proposals on their own are not enough, of course. So I'm not going to devise a sort of comprehensive plan for restoring Britain's demographics, but broadly speaking, we're talking about remigration and not simply being content to stop the demographic experiment halfway through, because so much of it is already baked in to future demographic projections, but also trying to reverse mass immigration as well, and to pursue a policy as we describe it of net negative immigration, remigration, we'll call it whatever you want, but basically doing our best to engineer a situation in which we don't just sort of shrug our shoulders and go, oh yes, well, the left and the right jointly in Britain has subjected us to a perverse, fanatical demographic experiment without a vote ever being cast in its favour or a shot ever fired in defence. But now that it's done, it's a fait accompli, and if you want to reverse it, then you must be some kind of fascist. I'm not going to accept those rules of engagement. I don't think we can reasonably be expected to suppose that our adversaries, our political adversaries, should be able to subject us to an experiment as damaging as this, and yet we are forbidden the right to reverse it. So pursuing practical policies, basically a mixture of negative and positive incentives, trying to get immigrants who have come into this country and who have not assimilated to leave. And of course, if they're foreign criminals, forcibly deporting them, and if they're illegal immigrants, forcibly deporting them, but using slightly subtler methods when it comes to people who admittedly have come here legally, albeit against the expressed wishes and interests of the British people.
So in Sweden, they're offering tens of thousands of dollars, or they will be from next year, to migrants who are unemployed or low-wage migrants, who the Swedish government have basically said, these people cost us a lot of money to keep in Sweden, and it's actually cheaper for us to give them a big handout. I think it's something like $30,000, maybe slightly more than that, to encourage them to leave. So would that be a kind of interesting, maybe something that you're looking at, that kind of policy to try and encourage, particularly like I said, from an economic perspective, you can talk about the cultural stuff as well, but from an economic perspective, we have millions of migrants who've come in recent years who undoubtedly, who don't work, who are dependents, or who are claiming benefits. I think it's 1.2 million on universal credit. So is that something that you'd be looking into or you're interested in?
Absolutely. So yes, a mixture of positive financial inducements, namely offering people money in order to leave, and negative financial inducements, which means taking away all sorts of perks that they presently enjoy, basically making life in Britain less congenial to people who are here and whose presence we're filming this in Hungary, but who are in Britain and whose presence in Britain is not in the interests of the British people. So absolutely, those are the sorts of policies that we would be taking an interest in. And just to bring a little bit of history into proceedings, when Dwight Eisenhower embarked on a policy of mass deportations, or at the time it was called Operation Wetback, in the 1950s, in order to try, in this case, to deport illegal immigrants who had been moving in and working as agricultural workers in the 1950s. This was very unpopular, and Eisenhower promised to deport these people. Reflective of the fact that you don't need to be coercive with everyone is this little statistic. For every one person who was forcibly deported in the 1950s as part of Operation Wetback, 9 or 10 left voluntarily. So this goes to show that it doesn't actually have to be an ultra-dramatic process. And in fact, I would say that the less dramatic it is, the better, apart from anything else, because the media will seize upon all sorts of sob stories to try and weaken the resolve of any government intent on pursuing this kind of policy. And you know what politicians are like. They care about popularity, particularly in our sort of media circus, democratic societies. They're obsessed with the weekly news agenda. So that could be very disruptive. So what you want to try and have is a situation in which as many people as possible are basically being given inducements, whether positive or negative, to leave, and therefore you don't have to endure all of the drama and theatre of deporting people coercively. You would reserve those cases for people who are violent, for people who have committed crimes, for people who are illegal immigrants, who are a threat to public safety, or maybe already in prison. I think we have something like 10,000 foreign nationals in our prisons. So that absolutely we'd be interested in pursuing those sort of policy lines.
So you've mentioned throughout the interview, you desire Britain to be more homogenous, ethnically homogenous. You said we're in Hungary, we're at the MCC Fest. Hungary is a more homogenous society. This gets a lot of criticism, and you get a lot of criticism. And I have got a lot of criticism recently for a film that I made about Britain and the changes in British demography, changes in British culture in particular because of immigration. And the argument that people said to me, and I'm sure they've said it to you many times, is that Britain should be a diverse place. It makes Britain more interesting. It makes it more culturally interesting. It has more fantastic food and interesting people from all around the world. It doesn't matter about ethnicity. Ethnicity doesn't exist. And, to suggest otherwise is racist.
Well, firstly, it should be said that I don't know about you, but I have very little appetite for being colonized by Albanians who seem pretty white to me. So it's not necessarily a racial case that is being made. I suppose if we lived in a world in which these sorts of tribal intensities and tribal affiliations didn't matter to human beings, then there may be some water in that argument that they make. But invariably, if you look around the world and go to the places that are most diverse, not just along ethnic lines, but along religious lines, but along tribal lines in Africa, along linguistic lines, even sometimes among clan lines or familial lines. You've got competing sort of Capulet and Montague type skirmishes going on in rural parts of Somalia and all this sort of. The more diversity you have within a given territory, the more prone that area is going to be to ethnic conflict, to stresses, tensions, corruption, people giving out government positions not according to merit, but sort of trying to help out their mates. Like, this is a very, very common activity that you see all over the most diverse parts of the third world. And it seems pretty logical to infer that the more we make Britain, or anywhere else, France, Sweden, demographically resemble those parts of the world, the more our societies are going to be subject to exactly those sorts of stresses, exactly those sorts of frictions, exactly those sorts of clannish, ethnic loyalties breaking out, whether it's and indeed this is what we've seen. I mean, every day there is some story that has this angle about it. If you look at Pakistanis and Indians fighting in Leicester over a cricket match, when the government wants to enforce child protection laws in Hare Hills, the Roma community is up in arms because it views this as an intolerable interference in their own internal affairs. People, whether we like it or not, are naturally groupish, and I think that it is quintessentially and paradigmatically conservative, not to want to try and change human nature, but to try and work and cooperate and work with the grain of human nature in the interests of social flourishing. And so I don't think that this recognizing the fact that human beings are intrinsically tribal and that tribalism is an important feature of both individual and collective human psychology necessitates any sort of hatred of outsiders as such, which is how I would understand the term racism. I think racism, as it means more or less nothing anymore. It's been completely denuded of meaning, but the way I would understand it is basically reducing a man and hating a man for his race and for no other reason. And in order to have one's finger on the pulse of human nature and to recognize that in-group preferences just are a feature of the world, you don't need to do any of that. So I reject the accusation pretty handily. Did I miss anything?
No. Do you think that politicians of the past have worried too much about being called racist?
Oh, easily, yes. Yes, it's a very effective way of shutting down debate. When Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, this accusation was thrown at him. But also, curiously, another thing that was thrown at him when he made that speech in 1968 was like people were accusing him of being an alarmist. It's very interesting if you go back and look at those debates at the time. People don't say you are wrong to point to these concerns, Mr. Powell. They don't say that. They say you are blowing these concerns out of all proportion. It's absurd to say that there will ever be a time in British history when our cities are effectively occupied by immigrant populations. You're exaggerating the figures. You're fiddling the figures in order to cause alarm just because you want to unseat Ted Heath, as I think it was then, and become the next generation of conservatism. If anything, Powell's predictions were conservative.
He got it completely wrong. He got it completely wrong. He massively underestimated the demographic change.
Correct. And so there's a sense in which when you're saying, oh, you're inflaming the situation by, there's almost a concession when people like David Frost, who interviewed Powell at the time, accuse him of fiddling the figures. It's almost as if David Frost is conceding that were these predictions to be true, they would be a cause of concern. And indeed, they are.
So, again, we're in Hungary, and Hungary now is fairly homogenous. But obviously it used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that empire crumbled partly due to its multicultural society. And you can look in the late 90s or mid-90s, there was an awful civil war in Yugoslavia. Again, another example of where diversity isn't necessarily a strength. You probably agree.
Completely agree. And one of the features of 20th century history, and this is something that Neil Ferguson, who's a fairly mainstream centre-right historian, talks about in his book *The War of the World*, which is a very comprehensive and good investigation into basically all of the world conflict from roughly, I think, 1914 to 1989 or to 1991. He says arguably the sort of one of the central themes of the 20th century was the like dissension of human societies into barbarism amid crumbling empires. Because when you have an empire that is intact, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or in Austro-Hungary, and like the British Empire in India, or indeed like the Yugoslav, whatever you want to call it, federation in Yugoslavia, or in the former Yugoslavia, you have a sort of imperial presence that keeps a lid on those sorts of intertribal tensions. But once that imperial power retreats, so often you see people who had been intimidated by the existence of the imperial power and didn't want to express. It was not in their interest to express their kind of to engage in sort of bloodletting of their neighbours. All of a sudden descends into a horrific ethnic civil war. And I think if I'm not mistaken, in the India-Pakistan War, immediately after the British left in 1947, just millions of people murdered and displaced. And so yes, we should be like all of my views about immigration are not simply informed by an analysis of British society over the last 25 years, 30 years, although of course that is a pretty important data point as well. Has the experiment gone well? It seems like an important question to ask. It's also based on an understanding of human history and human nature.
Another argument Fraser Nelson has made recently, and he's an interesting one. So he used to be the editor of The Spectator. Now I think he writes for The Times. He says that everyone who comes on small boats should be deported. But Britain has an obligation to poorer countries to take in refugees, and for every single one illegal who is deported, Britain should accept 3 genuine refugees through proper legal ways. What do you make of that argument that we've got a moral obligation to the entire world to help the poor, to help those in need, to help those fleeing wars, because we're a rich country? And I don't think Fraser makes this argument, but others do, that Britain, because of colonialism, because of the British Empire, we also owe these people. We're the ones, it's our fault that these countries are in such terrible positions, and therefore, again, we have a moral obligation to accept everyone from around the world.
Well, firstly, it's an obligation. If it does exist as a moral obligation, then it's one that is impossible to discharge short of absolute self-destruction. And the view that I take of the matter is that if people like Fraser Nelson and others have a hard conscience about the experience of people in other parts of the world, then rather than importing all of that trauma, all of that disruption, all of that tribalism into our midst and externalizing the costs of their own high-minded charity onto people who have in fact not consented to be charitable in that way, pathologically altruistic in that way, he should go and be a missionary. And he should go and try and tend to the wounds of these places himself, rather than presuming to put us at risk. Because of course, what will happen in again, it's not a particularly controversial observation to say that if you have a homogeneous society, and again, I mean homogeneous along ethnic lines, I mean homogeneous along religious lines, I mean homogeneous along tribal lines, along linguistic lines, there are going to be high levels of social trust, there's going to be more human development, there's going to be, but all else being equal, there's going to be a greater degree human flourishing, democracy, rule of law. These things are more likely to work within that setup because they both depend on social trust, and stores of social trust are massively depleted when you have diversity, because people start thinking more in terms of what benefits their own little in-group as opposed to what's pro-social as a whole. And given that it's an empirical fact that discharging this obligation that Fraser-Nelson wants us to discharge would make us more ethnically and religiously diverse, and therefore create the sort of conditions for the third worldification of Britain, Britain actually wouldn't be a lifeboat for very long at all. And so I think that we are more likely to be able to improve the lot of other people around the world, which I think we should do, by the way, more out of self-interest. So not more out of self-interest, but out of self-interest as much as anything else, because otherwise we're just going to be facing hugely unsustainable immigration flows. I mean, there are billions of people around the world. The idea that Britain can serve indefinitely as a lifeboat without doing damage to itself, including damage to its capacity to sustain itself as a lifeboat. I think this is a very self-defeating proposition in the long run.
But what about birth rates? This is an argument that Aaron Bastani makes, that Britain's fertility rate has collapsed in recent years, like all other countries around the world, including actually places like India and China, and that we need a higher birth rate. Hungary is actually trying to instigate economic policies which have had, I think, mixed success and probably not really worked to boost the fertility rate. So we need the immigrants because we need people to work in jobs, and we need people to pay taxes in the future and so on.
Well, I mean, they should look at some of the data coming out of Denmark and the Netherlands. It's not as if these sort of third world replacements coming into our countries are likely to be the ones sustaining our pension systems, given that, considered at the median, they are overwhelmingly net fiscal takers, not net fiscal contributors. So just as a matter of empirical fact, I think that it's wrong. But secondarily, all you're doing, let's assume that they are net fiscal contributors, for the sake of argument. Again, I do not concede that for one moment. I don't think it is at all economically in our interest, even in the short term, to embark on this project or to continue embarking upon this project, or not to reverse this project. Let's assume that they were net sort of contributors to the Treasury, and therefore better able to sustain our economic systems and our economic structures and all the rest of it. By that point, you are basically post-national in your outlook. You're ceasing to think of the nation as the homeland for a particular people, and you're starting to look at it more as a sort of joint enterprise, as more of a sort of, as the way I like to put it, I think that conservative-minded people need to rediscover the original Greek meaning of the term economy. You need to first have a home, oikos, before you discuss the rules, nomos, best suited for its material flourishing. And if you're only focused on this sort of technocratic economic criteria, then you're going to be eroding the foundations that make it possible for you to have a home in the first place. And so, in short, if you follow the logic through of that argument, we're talking here about the abolition and erasure of the nation, and treating them as by turns charities and businesses, and I think that is an affront against our deepest intuitions about what it means to belong as human beings.
What would you recommend that young people who agree with you do today? Do you think they should work in politics? Do you think they should go into the media? Do you think they should, I don't know, become activists, blah, blah, blah? Or do you think, and also what should they read? Is there anything, that you would recommend? I know this is a long question, so forgive me. And who should they vote for in 2029? What's your advice?
In reverse order, I'm not going to tell them how to vote in 2029. Part of being Restore Britain, we try to be above the fray of party politics, and we encourage people, members of all parties, to join our ranks. And also, God knows what's going to be happening in 2029. There has never been, well, not in the last 100 years at least, as much electoral volatility in the system as all this. So it would be very unwise to be I don't even know how I'm going to vote in 2029, so I can hardly invite others how to do so. On the other points, I mean, okay, well, I would encourage people who are fond of the Anglo-American conservative tradition to read its seminal thinkers, and we're talking here about people like John Fortescue. We're talking about people like Richard Hooker. We're talking about people like John Selden. We're talking about people like Edmund Burke. We're talking about the American founding fathers. And we're talking in modern times about people like Roger Scruton, and to some extent, I would say as well, Yoram Hazany, who is not himself English, but is an admirer, a very fond intellectual admirer of this tradition. Read this work and ponder this fact. When they were writing within a milieu in which all of these demographic questions that you and I have been talking about could simply be taken for granted. So they didn't actually need to address whether we're going to be a homogeneous society or a diverse society, because they just existed in a homogeneous milieu. And no doubt fish struggle to appreciate water until they find themselves reeled out of it. We have been reeled out of our natural habitat as Anglos, if you like, and we are struggling to contend with this new situation. I would argue that the principles and the key themes of Anglo-American conservatism are actually very adequate to address this question. They just need to be extended as much to demographic issues as to constitutional ones, legal ones, political ones, the ones that we're more familiar with, the ones that have actually been addressed more by the names that I just listed. And finally, what should people do? I'm in favour of a healthy division of labour on this score. There is no sort of uniform bit of advice that I can give to people, but I would invite them to be introspective, think about what they're good at, think about what they're not so good at, think about what their strengths are, think about areas in which those strengths would best be put to use, and then decide whether you want to be a behind-the-scenes actor, a politico who acts behind the scenes, whether you want to be in front of the camera, whether you want to pursue academia, whether you want to be an activist, whether you want to do reporting, whether you want to be a politician. But you should. One bit of advice that I would give to people that I do think does generally obtain is try not to mix around with all of this stuff too much, because it's very difficult to oscillate in between lanes. And you could be prepared if you are going to be public facing, for the opprobrium that will undoubtedly come your way, particularly if you're being as outspoken and frank about things as you and I like to be.
Harrison, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.